project team would be dealing with middle school math and middle school English language arts at one time. That would be what we mean in terms of that piece. You might want to do upper elementary versus early elementary.
Right, that makes sense.
But it does actually affect every single school.
Right.
That's the idea.
Well, I have two sort of different sets of questions. One is about the merits of going forward, and I haven't really heard much about how, if the unit stays in the classroom, how that's going to translate for children who do not have access to similar type things at home. I mean, is the assumption that all the learning is going to take place in the classroom, or is the assumption that these students have electronic devices at home that they're going to be able to continue learning with?
So it's neither. It depends first on our advocacy to help adjust state law so that you don't run into any kind of conflict around Williams. And we're there in California, we have to figure this piece out around the issue of Williams was crafted in an era of non-digital text. It was only crafted in the notion that you had a textbook. We're rapidly past that, but the law doesn't account for that, around that. So that's one piece that we have to be able to do. So in other words, a device that is Williams compliant, could that go home? Yes. If it's currently not, we have to be able to figure out how that would square. Second issue is we really need to have an understanding of individual students' own device issue. We are just really, that's why you saw this bring your own device piece as part of this pilot. That may allow us to make concentration in places where we have two issues, connectivity and device or lack of device in terms of that piece. And 5 and 6 years out, the device itself may actually have grown and improved so that we have less worry about loss as we move in and out of this. We don't have a firm answer for that yet, and we'll want to work with both our industry partners and we'll want to work with our legislative advocates in Sacramento around this piece. Ideally, we would like this to be a case where it could be.
I have another piece.
Yep.
Also, we are learning a lot. We're learning a lot in terms of some of our pilots. So, for example, Maywood and Melrose. So Maywood is in this is their second year. Melrose is into their third year. So they all have one-on-one device that they don't take it home. They don't take it home. So we don't want learning to stop when kids go home. So the teachers have come up with a structure where they're very strategic on what's the work that has to be done at home and what materials need to go to support. So the Common Core has also emphasized that we're focusing on key concept and less. So in mathematics, it could be just one or two major problem, and the teachers can assign it without necessarily having to be dependent on the device. So those models have really helped us to think about what would happen for homework and reinforcement at home.
And my other question does deal with the funding, and for those of you that don't know, the $40 million that was sitting there that is now some of which is being taken, it didn't just get automatically repaid. It took a considerable amount of advocacy from the early education community. I didn't lead it, I was part of it, but there were 5 or 6 organizations that had to do a lot of advocacy to get that $40 million back. So I don't want anyone here to think that just because it's borrowed, it's going to automatically happen. Things have a way. Once the money's gone, people kind of forget about it, and it sort of takes a life of its own. So that's obviously one concern. Another is that all of the money is coming from early education, but I haven't heard anything that would indicate that this is going. There's been no discussion of how these units would be used, if at all, in early education. And finally, I guess one of my questions is, when it gets repaid, all the bond funds that we know about right now have allocations. So when these future bonds get sold, they're already allocated for things. So from what pot of money is this going to get repaid? I don't really get that. And I certainly don't understand the assumption that it will be repaid by the time there are early education centers, because while I appreciate that that's the hope, where is the cash flow analysis, and where is the indication that that would all be true?
Mark, do you want to respond to that?
The triple R is actually not allocated now. In fact, it's savings that we've had from the original program, so 100% of that is unallocated. The future sale of bonds, it does have some programs that are specifically identified, but it has a lot of flexibility in that. Over half of the future sale of bonds have that flexibility, and in fact, all of Measure R and Measure Y, which is $675 million, do not have a specific allocation defined yet. It's yet to be defined by this committee and by the board. So there are certainly plenty of opportunities. I certainly understand and appreciate that it took a long time to get that money back, but we were in a completely different environment. We were in a budget shortfall. We didn't have enough money to complete the program at that time. When the money was restored was when the economy had turned and we suddenly started getting bids for 30% less than what our estimates were, as opposed to 30% more than our estimate. So it's a completely different environment. We're actually in a very fortunate environment of being able to finish under budget, so again, it's strictly a cash flow initiative. If we had the triple R recovery sooner than we had, then we wouldn't be looking to this. We would go straight to the triple R to fund this program. My most realistic expectation is that the triple R will be available within the next several months, long ahead of any allocation. And we had the $40 million that was taken and it was restored 2 years ago, and in that 2 years, after being without the $40 million for close to 5 years, less than half of it has actually been spent in that 2-year period. So we think it's a very short time frame compared to what the actual identified use and approved use will be.
My comment to that has nothing to do with the cash flow issue. It has to do with the fact that we come here in front of you and made that very explicit. I don't make statements of public that I don't live to or direct my team to live up to. When we say that this is a proposal in front of you, we intend to live exactly by what we propose to do around that. That's my obligation at the Board of Education. It's my obligation as the leader of the system.
I think we're doing pretty well, but just going down the line here, Scott, so even though you had your hand up for something, just to continue our progress my left to my right.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the budget issues, it is a zero-sum game, though, correct? The bond funds are limited, and monies that go to pay for this initiative come from bond funds that aren't growing. So I think that's an important thing to acknowledge.
Do you want to comment then? On growing but not allocated.
Unallocated, but the voters approved the bonds for construction projects by and large. And so I'm concerned about, and that'll be my next question, but I just want to.
Going by your bond counsel's advice on this, which you referenced.
Well, my understanding is that council is not definitive in that this is a legitimate use for bond funds. I don't think the voters passed these bonds thinking they were going to tablets. That's, I think, when I've talked about it to people, there's a lot of surprise that this is a legitimate expense for the bond fund. So I'm very concerned about that, and I think, and we'll just keep going, but I think the 17 million is one thing, but we're really talking about a program of 600 or 700 to $1 billion. So if Measure Q is 9 billion, then 7 billion, so we're talking about 1/7 of Measure Q if you're within your budget range, and I think that's a challenging assumption. So I'm very concerned that the will of the voters is being denied with this request, and I think the monies are not really bond suitable.
Then you shouldn't approve it. Don't start this if you're not going to support this, if that's your concern. That would definitely be my take. If you do not want to support the students in having this, then don't do it.
If I can add a couple points of information, we talked about the $40 million that was borrowed from the Early Ed Center to support the construction program, and it took a long time to bring that back. There was also $200 million that was borrowed from the IT for the same thing. The bonds were about construction, but they also very specifically, they were about creating the facility learning environment of which the IT was a part of. So certainly in Measure R and in Measure Y, there were specific allocations within the bonds for technology, and most certainly in Measure Q there was a very substantial piece that was dedicated specifically for ITD projects and projects that are of this very nature.
Agreed, but for things like the IT backbone, the Wi-Fi network, the wiring, not for the tablets, not for computers.
Right.
And I think that's where it seems problematic to me, and an abrogation of the voters' will.
And it's true, but as technology progresses, wireless is part of that backbone, whereas before we would run a wire to every table, and now we have devices that we don't have to. The cost is actually less than it was at the time it was contemplated to perform the exact same function.
The wireless is completely makes sense. I think it's the devices themselves that are the issue in my opinion.
We could have, no, I was going to suggest Mr. Rubin has spent some time looking into this issue, and if you'd like him to address that specifically, he has indicated he would be available to share his results of his research with you.
Great.
So do you want to
Please
do that now?
Please, thank you.
Unfortunately, Joe Buckman, our legal counsel, had a conflict and couldn't be here today. He and I have discussed this at length. Let's go back a little bit to the structure of bond issues themselves. And what is presented to the voters and has been approved by the voters is a long list of allowable expenditures. At the same meeting where the bond issue is approved by the board to be presented to the voters, there is also a preliminary budget that is approved as part of the package. This, however, is not presented to the voters. It is a board action, and therefore it can be changed by a subsequent board, and that has occurred in our past bond issues. So what we have is, in the bond issue, what the allowable projects are, and then a preliminary budget which can be and has been changed. Going through several bond issues, including R and Y and Q, which are the most important because they are still alive, they still have funding. All of these have in the allowable uses projects for information technology to support what's going on in the classrooms. And Joe and I, along with many others, including bond counsel, have all reached the conclusion that these are allowable under the terms of the bond issues that have been approved by the voters. It then is a matter for the board with the BOC to make recommendations as to what are the highest and best uses. And that's why this is here before you today. So it's allowable, it is not mandatory. It is up to the board with the advice of the BOC to make a decision as to the highest and best use. Thank you.
Questions, if anybody?
Okay, Stuart, back to you.
Great, thank you. Well, I think the point I'm trying to make is that if this program goes forward, then the monies, the master planning effort that is being completed now will be further limited from its effectiveness and how far we can roll out the master planning effort that is being conducted now by facilities. As you indicated to me after last meeting, we're already underfunded probably to finish the master planning effort. So I'm concerned if we're taking close to $1 billion away from that effort to fund this initiative. You know, I appreciate your points, and I think as I understand fitting out schools with technology or projects with technology, if you do a significant renovation and new construction, of course, new computers would be part of the, FF&E budget, and that would make sense. But if you're talking about district-wide using bond monies to put laptops or desktops or whatever it might be, to deploy them to the schools, it seems like that's really kind of breaking the spirit of what these funds are for. So I'm very concerned about that, and I think the implication as to what can be achieved with the voters' money, particularly with Measure Q, are going to be significantly reduced if this goes forward and is funded through this way. I think what I'm suggesting is funding should come from another source. So that would be my significant concern with this initiative. I do have a couple other detailed questions that I would love to get a quick handle on. You mentioned that our special needs students are about 10% of the population, and our English, our ESL students are about 30% of the population. What's the overlap between those two percentages? Do we know?
I don't know the exact percentage, but I do know that we do have an overrepresentation of English language learners within the special ed.
Okay. it'd be helpful if we could get
Sure.
that
We can get
data point would be great. And then just understand the cost, again, going back to the budget, there's a $470 million amount for, I guess, the backbone work. Is that in addition to the, was it $230 million that we approved for the IT?
No, so the 470 million was approved by this body several months ago in the ITSE Strategic Execution Plan. It's not an additional, it's a separate pot of
Okay.
money, yes.
For some reason I had that as a 200 million, but it's the 470 is the number.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to sort of echo Stuart's concerns about the use of bond funds for this project. And I've been through council's opinion, and council relies on some language in the, I believe, the ballot proposition that said hardware and software for information technology applications, which in my reading and in discussion with other people in other jurisdictions, information technology applications, I think, is more related to an enterprise utilization of a system, a payroll or an accounting system, rather than declaring that a tablet on a child's desk is an information technology application for purposes of bond funding. I also note that bond counsel referred to the tablets meet the requirements of capital assets in accordance with the school accounting manual, and I pulled up the school accounting manual, and it references two things, one of which is that under education code, an asset has to be valued at more than $500 to meet the definition of a capital asset. The manual also refers to the Government Finance Officers Association definition of capital assets, and they have a $5,000 threshold for capital assets. So I'm not sure that what we're talking about here meets those definitions of capital assets for purposes of long-term financing. So, I mean, I don't dispute the efficacy or the value of the program per se. My issue is whether this really meets, as Stuart said, the intent and spirit of long-term financing. So.
All right, thank you. Now, Tom, did you want to, could you shed some light on that?
A couple of matters. First of all, bond funds these are school construction bond funds, so they cannot be used for administrative purposes such as a payroll or general ledger application. That is thrown out by legislation. So the definition of application should be considered in that context. It has to be for an educational purpose actually at the school site. We understand this question, and this is an important question, and Joe and I have both spent a lot of time both with the statutes and the bond issues ourselves, and with working with bond counsel to understand their thinking. And while we understand why there are questions about it, Joe and I are both satisfied that the council opinion is valid. It has been consistently used throughout the state. It has been used here at the district for many years as we have purchased desktops and laptops in the past with bond funds. And many, many other school districts around the state have also used it for those purposes. And to date, there has not been objections or responses. Yes?
Your sample, though, is that around filling out a new constructed project, or is it around essentially supplying something to a school that hasn't been rebuilt or built new? So I think that's a key. So
both new schools and existing schools. Just as for traditional capital projects, the bonds are used for construction of new schools and for replacement of facilities, upgrading, modernization of facilities on existing schools. So the same thing goes for IT infrastructure in the classroom and getting it to the classroom, whether it's a new school or an existing school. The practice throughout the state has been that bond funds can be used for this purpose. As far as the capital expenditure to date, when we go with the entire cost, including the installation, the software, et cetera, it has been exceeding the $500 limit. So that has not been a major concern. And we are watching that to see how the prices go. This is an interesting situation where we're interested to see where the prices are, and if they are too low, then we'll be going back to bond council.
Paul, yes.
Lots of questions have been asked already. Perhaps it's because of my my current role that I have been here before on a school site implementing a one-to-one program. What I've been humbled by has been the amount of on-site support that's required for an endeavor like this. And Mr. Superintendent, I took notice in your initial budget that you have a capital outlay of about $4 million in resources, particularly around staffing, which represents about 24% of the entire budget for a demonstration project. What I noticed about this was that it did not include on-site IT coordination. Seeing that that is going to likely be a general fund obligation, where does this rank? Maybe you can't speak for the board, but maybe you can speak just for your administration. Where does this rank in the number of priorities that are before the school district today with respect to staffing capacity on site? Knowing that the larger you scale up, the more support you're going to need, and perhaps this has been solved through a relationship with vendors to supply on-site support for repair and maintenance.
Correct.
Though I think it is important, as we look at my fellow members of the committee, up to $1 billion endeavor, what that on-site support profile could look like and the impact of the general fund, which of course is not our place, but would be the place of the superintendent and the Board of Education.
It actually ranks very high. If you're going to do this and you're going to provide this opportunity for students, which is, I think, critical, then you have to have the obligation to support that. Some of it is mitigated through vendor support. There's no question about that, but not all of it. And so that is precisely why we chose to do this as a 1A and 1B, because we have got some experience at elementary schools and a little bit at middle schools. That's why we have 13 secondary schools in the first project.
And so for the demo projects, with respect to on-site IT coordination, how will the school budgets be leveraged, if at all? Or will that be additional resources that will come from the general fund in order to support the on-site servicing of these devices?
It's either going to be a reallocation of current resources or additional. That's why you see it as a small project. Because we do need to, I mean, I've worked at schools myself. You're absolutely right. It's very intensive if it's to work well.
And the trade-offs, I won't bore anyone. Trade-offs between counselors, class size reduction, and everything in between are extraordinary. And it would be a real unfortunate outcome if we were unable to see an initiative like this implemented because those trade-offs did not favor the IT coordination component. So it's more of a cautionary note, Mr. Superintendent, members, just in keeping with the infrastructure investment, the support investment as well has to be equal, if not greater, to support this long term. Thank
Absolutely.
Scott.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. I actually agree with what you want to do here. I actually agree that this is the right step to be taking. I have certain concerns about where the money's coming from and all that, and I'm hoping moving forward we can answer those questions before we get to the point, and that's why we're doing a pilot here, or why you're suggesting a pilot, is we can see where we are and moving forward. I would hope that the Board of Education, under your leadership, would make a commitment to return the loan as soon as possible to early childhood ed. I realize...
Let's rephrase that. The Board of Education is not under my leadership.
Well, no,
I
right.
am
Okay.
one of the leadership of the Board
Listening
of
to your
Education.
leadership
Okay.
or probed and
Very
poked
important
and
technical point.
led, kicking and screaming.
It would be my absolute, it's
Right,
been my
and
public
I would
position here.
like to, it'd be great if they would write that down somewhere and, or cross their hearts and hope to, well, maybe not
Put it this
that
way,
much.
it is in my recommendation to the board in public writing.
Right, yeah, and I understand that. So that said, we went and took a look at Ivanhoe and at King. Ivanhoe, which you have on your list as a potential school, has actually got all this stuff in place. They've paid for it through other sources. They're sending the units home because they paid for them with their own funds, and that's great. I see a Williams issue kind of lurking as the district rolls it around, and School A and School B have different programs. This is just, I think we're going to have Williams. The other thing is, if we're expecting these units to last, devices, that was the word, devices to last for 10 years, I think we can anticipate that sometime during that 10 years, those will become items that go home. Maybe in that time, the Wi-Fi issue gets, the Wi-Fi, and so I would hope that when we design, if it's by contract, working with the vendor, or by purchase, or however we do that, that we realize that at a point in time, they're going to need to be beyond Wi-Fi, I think. So I'm hoping that I don't want to, Moore's Law applies here. Nobody's talked about it, but, 10, I would think that if we're expecting a 10-year life out of these units, probably it's different units at the end of 10 years than
Yeah,
at
I
the
think that's
beginning.
important to say that when we said it needs to have its complete service and functionality for 10 years, that doesn't necessarily mean that the device itself is designed to last 10 years. It means that it must
Right.
be functioning, whether it's replace, refresh, redesign.
Right.
We don't pay any more. You have guaranteed this to work like this for 10 years.
Which then gets me to the question of, because leasing is kind of tossed out as not being, it seems to me that maybe that is, or something like leasing maybe be an option, but once again, I'm not going to, I think we all need to have the flexibility moving forward. A little bit of a discussion happened at the end of the table. What happens if we suddenly can get these things much cheaper and they go below that threshold? I hope we don't go out and try and find the most expensive unit possible so that it qualifies for bond funding. But the piece that comes to me that worries me the most here is that IT person at the school, the guy with the green screwdriver in his pocket, and the understanding of how to make these systems work. Because at the schools that we went and visited, those were the key players. And I think, and I am going to go to Maywood. I spoke to the principal yesterday, and she invited me. You'll probably be calling her and saying, "What have you done?" But I would like to see that position at each school centrally funded, guaranteed, so that we take it off the people who have to make the decision about counselors and nurses and librarians. That the district, by making this initiative and by providing these devices and pushing this forward, also stands behind the maintenance. And if you do it by contract, many of those people probably will be, people that come with the deal. But we need to know that the people are there to support the education and the technology at the school site. And I think the only way to do that is using the district's economy of scale and being a little bit of a 10-ton gorilla to force.
We used to be
Yeah.
a 10-pound gorilla. We're not anymore.
Right.
So we put more than 90 cents of every dollar out to schools.
Right.
So it's a dilemma. We don't have central budgets.
Right.
We removed more than 54% of every human being in Beaudry in the last 2 years
Right. Well,
to go to sites. So we've got to figure out a way to do that. We need to, but I don't want to have everybody have this impression that there is some pot of money, because if it was, we would have bought teachers.
So,
doesn't exist.
yeah. So it's an interesting dilemma. I look forward to working with everybody on pushing this forward because I think this is the direction. I noticed that in some of the numbers that you gave in your report here, what the district is trying to do is almost exactly on the same scale as what's happened nationally to date with numbers. I'm hoping and I'm guessing and I'm asking that certainly you guys are having this same conversation with the people in New York and the people in Chicago, and because they too, it's not a competition. Everybody together's got to get there.
Right.
So I have many more questions, and maybe at some point I will put them in writing. But thank you very much.
Definitely.
Yes, Eva.
I have a very simple question, and that is,